Electrocast.
How many discounts does USAA Auto Insurance offer? Too many to say here. Multi-vehicle discount, safe driver discount, new vehicle discount, storage discount, legacy.
How many discounts will you stack up? Visit USAA.com/auto discounts. Restrictions apply.
It's the Smucker's Uncrustables podcast with your host, Uncrustables. Okay, today's guest is rough around the edges. Please welcome Crust.
Thanks for having me.
Today's topic, he's round with soft pillowy bread.
Hey.
Filled with delicious PB&J.
Are you talking about yourself?
And you can take him anywhere.
Why'd you invite
And we are out of time.
Are you really cutting me off?
Uncrustables are the best part of the sandwich. Sorry, Crust.
So I think part of the challenge is definitely trying to make sure that, it's fun enough to do the activity that the person doesn't feel like they need to skip the whole thing by climbing a really tall tower. But at some point I realized that there's only so much you can block players, and sometimes it's kind of fun for a player to try and get through and find that gap.
So, Tanya Funk, thanks for coming on. Why don't you start with a little bit by introducing yourself, what your most recent work was, and and then we can jump into a topic.
Sounds good. Well, I am a game designer. I've been primarily focusing on level and encounter design in the last couple of years. My original start was actually in bioinformatics and computational media design. So I was working on medical simulations, things like the giant walkthrough brain presentation that you would do in a science center, all in Unity. From there, I moved on to making safety and training simulators for the electrical and oil and gas industry, because I'm in Alberta. That is a big part of Alberta. Yep. And then after that, I went in as a level designer, became a lead level designer at a small startup here in Calgary, and then went to Studio Monsoon, a co-dev program also in Calgary, and I worked on Nightingale, which was my last game-related project. I worked on Nightingale from when it was originally released in early access all the way up till Nightingale City, which was the very last part of it was created.
So, also, what was the project you worked with Evan on? I forgot about that one.
Oh, that is, I was creating the user flow for their app for helping people with ADHD, primarily women with ADHD, kind of gain a bit more control in their lives.
That's right. Yeah, because it's interesting. So I don't think I've ever given you this feedback. So we had a very odd situation for your interview for Studio Monsoon, and I interviewed you from the car. But I remember being extremely impressed afterwards with not only your ability to context switch on the fly, but also take some of my jargony abstract questions and reapply your knowledge to them. And so I went from like, oh yeah, sure, an interview, to be like, oh man, instant hire. Absolutely instant hire. So
it was a fun interview, stressful a bit. But honestly, I think the stressful part was just from you driving and me not being able to show with my hands what I was trying to answer. But it was a fun interview in the sense that I got a lot of the typical questions of like, where do you see yourself in 5 years and so on. So getting to do practical problem solving is always a way funner thing to do, and also is just a better representation of what I'm able to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. So no peanut butter and jelly sandwich questions or anything like that. I always try to dig in a little bit to who the game designer I think that you are and who you could be. So tell me a little bit about Nightingale. So that must have been super interesting. Like that game, I love the look. I love the idea of the world. I'm not much of an open world crafter kind of a person, but before we dig into it a little bit, give everybody some idea, assuming that they haven't played it, the blurby 2-line description of what Nightingale is.
So it is a Victorian era gaslamp fantasy, as they explain it. It is a survival crafter that is set in the 1890s when magic kind of returned to London. It was inspired by a book called Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and it was supposed to be kind of afterwards as an inspiration. So Magic Return, there's contracts with Fae, and then something goes wrong. Most of the earth is covered in this dark thing called the Pale, and you're transported through into a different realm, and your goal is to survive those realms, travel between them, and eventually find your way back to Nightingale City, which is a made-up place somewhere in Europe.
Okay, so mainland Europe, not like London. So it's interesting. So like from afar, I got to watch some of the things that you were working on and some of the things you were building, and we discussed some of those bits and pieces. But I remembered you having some frustrations around some like late stage traversal mechanics. So like let's start with a little bit about some of the problems with like a new traversal to a game that is already basically running.
So first of all, Nightingale is a live service game, which of course brings its own challenges, because when realms are generated, you can't really easily change sections of the levels that have already been created without causing problems, especially in a game where you have building mechanics. So you can be building and that could, overlap with things, all sorts of problems. Now, having said that, Nightingale actually has some pretty fun traversal mechanics. One of my favorite ones, and I think everyone's favorite one, is using an umbrella to fly, Mary Poppins style. It's so whimsical to be flying away from like a raging hippo.
It's so like pillar appropriate for the fantasy, right? When I hear like gas lamp, and there's kind of like a steampunky vibe to some of the stuff in the world, but I guess Gaslamp is more appropriate. But to use an umbrella, it's like it fits the IP so well. Like it feels nice. It does call up the like Mary Poppins imagery of like flying around the world like prim and proper with your umbrella. It's super cool.
And the first time I actually tried it, I didn't even know that you could fly with the umbrella. I kind of discovered that in the game, which is honestly so much funner than discovering it from seeing a trailer. Just being like, wait, I got this umbrella at the very top of the tower, and I don't want to run all the way back down. Can I? It's a fun way to introduce the mechanic.
Well, that's always like, I don't watch a lot of gaming videos because I think it's partially the era I grew up in, but like I have a heavy reward structure around exploration, and I particularly like doing things that are fall under the category of emergent gameplay, where it's like, oh, this thing combined with that thing lets me do this thing that I don't think the designers intended. Or maybe they intended, but it wouldn't be part of a tutorial, right? Like early days of physics really enabled some wild stuff. But I don't think I've encountered an umbrella before. I would say that's a 100% unique mechanic. So call up one of the challenges I think that you ran into as far as like, you mentioned one specifically, which was like, hey, how do I design traversal, like challenging traversal, but in a world where people can basically build their own stepping stones or ladders, right? So like it becomes like the structural design of building traversal becomes challenging because you have to take in like powers that players, potentially didn't have in a traditional sense.
For sure. And so, like, there's actually been a challenge with a dungeon that was supposed to have been a floating dungeon or something that was set high up on top of an aqueduct. And there's open sections of it so you could fall out if you weren't careful. But that also means that technically you could climb in. It would just take you a while. So I think part of the challenge is definitely trying to make sure that it's fun enough to do the activity that the person doesn't feel like they need to skip the whole thing by climbing a really tall tower. But at some point, I realized that there's only so much you can block players, and sometimes it's kind of fun for a player to try and get through and find that gap. And as long as they can't easily get to the very end or to like the really key parts, I think sneaking in halfway through is also kind of interesting. Yeah, that one was a small aside. The biggest challenge I definitely had was there's a realm called Welkin's Reach. It's the third realm in the game, and as called by people on Reddit, Bouncy Castle Funland. So all of these realms have different like minor cards which activate some kind of realm-wide effect. And in that one, it was lower gravity. So on top of you being able to jump and fly with your umbrella, you would be able to jump even higher and like float down,
Okay.
which really changed the metrics of everything.
Sure.
And then on top of that, we had climbing picks, where you can use to climb vertical walls. And around early access already came out and we were doing updates, we were told that they were adding grapple hook functionality to the climbing picks. And all of a sudden you can grapple to objects and no longer are you limited by the vertical surface. And that honestly changed everything.
Yeah.
Because now ways that we blocked things by having like a border around a vertical wall, all of a sudden now you can just grapple over it.
So okay, I've got a combo that I think is probably a problem for you, but I want to back up a little bit. You said you breezed through a thing called minor cards. Let me see if I can summate it, and you can say that whether I'm correct or not. So my inference understanding of that is that players have realm changing, like some sort of card set, and so a player could play that card. Does it affect everybody in the realm?
Yes.
Does it affect the whole? So if you and I showed up and we had a combination of cards, and I said low gravity, and you played another card that was like windy, then it would be windy low gravity for everybody.
Just one card. So there's like one realmic transmuter, and in our storied realms, or actually in all the realms, the whole realm would start with a specific card that would be decided by us. But then after you're done a key amount of quests, you would have access to that transmuter, and then you can change it to a different card, which could be like, it's always raining, it's always sunny, that kind of thing.
And that affects everybody. So basically, so do you find that players are griefing each other at all, or having accidental griefing where they're like, I changed it to rainy, so it makes it really hard for some people in the world? Or like,
you can't go into other people's realms unless they give you access to it, so like an address card, and you can have up to 6 players in a realm, so you can play with like 5 other friends. So you can grief people, like but only people you love.
Got it. So it's not like open MMO style. It's more like we're all online and I can bring other people into my co-op my realm. But like, do they come in as themselves, or do they
as themselves,
like, fully powered?
And there's like one specific realm where you can have a bunch of people on a server, and that's the only one, but you're limited. You can't build in there, for example, and you can't kill other people.
Okay, so you give up some powers to be able to be more social.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the combo I was thinking of. So just so I can set this up, I'm going to describe the geometry a little bit. It might be a little dry for a second, but let's say 100-foot vertical wall, and whatever, at the top is the prize. And so the original way to go through it would be like, you were saying they were pickaxes, or they were like ice axes, where
climbing picks,
like climbing picks, and so I could climb up hand over hand, like I'm doing. Like I know people can't see this, but essentially left hand then right hand, then left hand then right hand. Okay, but then those climbing picks also then got a grappling hook, right? It could attach to anything. Mostly?
To a lot of things, and pull you in. Granted, depending on how you do it with your skills, you might fall back down. And as you get higher up, like as your climbing picks level up, you can shoot them further along. Before it's like a few meters, and then it gets kind of huge in terms of how far you can go.
So I was just thinking, like, okay, if you've got low gravity, I can jump high. Let's make the wall 200 feet now, because, like, I think 100 feet then becomes rather too easy. But if the wall's 200 feet high, and you're like, no, what I want you to do is go 100 feet, like, transition to a ledge, and then climb the next 100 feet. Basically, like, I could do low gravity, climb the wall up to 80 feet, like, jump off the wall, umbrella, and then grapple over the obstruction to the next 100-foot section, right?
Yeah.
Like something like that. And so basically, like, combos like that essentially make traversal. Well, I guess I would feel clever as a player for figuring that out, but at the same time, for a game designer's POV, it might be a little bit, but that's not what I intended, right?
Yeah, and I mean the difficult parts, especially for, encounters that have already been created, that are already in the game for players, that were not meant for that kind of traversal. Like all of a sudden you can get through windows that you couldn't get through before. Yeah. Which, for the most part, if it's dungeons, it's okay, but the dungeon I was doing, the Site of Power called the Portal Well, that was an open air dungeon.
Okay.
And the tricky part there is you're supposed to be going down to the bottom, and it's a dungeon, so you don't want them to do like one thing and be done with it. And they wanted to be able to see this broken portal at the very bottom, so I couldn't just restrain, like I couldn't have layers to this dungeon. So my big problem that I was trying to solve was, how do we make it so that the player doesn't want to just use their umbrella and fly all the way down to the bottom and be done with it, because they can, but like they can see it, they can reach it, especially with all the traversal options that we have.
So just like two things. One, it's kind of like watching somebody's like science project where their pet hamster goes into a maze to get the cheese, and the hamster just climbs up on top of the wall and goes straight across.
Yeah. And you're like, hey, but
you're like, hey,
that's what players are going to do.
That's not the rules, right?
Yeah.
But it also brings up like a sort of a different topic of discussion. And I'm going to do this a little bit Socratically. So, because basically what we're talking about is player brain versus like actually in contention with each other. Designer brain versus player brain. And, you know, the situation you're talking about had a very accepted set of rules that changed for some reason, especially with the introduction of grappling hook. And so it's changed the power dynamic in that I'm giving you tasks to do, but you now have new tools to deal with. So the first question I'm going to ask is not super mechanical, is actually, how did you feel when that happened?
A bit stressed. Well, part of me, like, I thought the grapple hook idea was cool. I just wish that it was introduced earlier on, I think is my biggest problem. But in terms of the actual dungeon, honestly, I thought it was a really unique concept, and I was just excited because we went from older dungeons where each boss was basically the same. It wasn't as core of a part to our team was now allowed to recreate all of the dungeons in the game. So we could really almost start over with all these new tools that we had, and try to make this something memorable. And like the portal well, if you see images of it, is actually a really cool visual structure. And I just wanted to make sure that actually being in that structure didn't feel like busy work. Like it felt like, okay, I get why I am doing this, and also I want to spend a bit more time exploring this area, and I want it to mean something.
Sure. Okay. So there's a little bit to unpack there. So, and correct me where I'm wrong, and this is the way I'm reading it, is that the first word you said was stressed, right? And so stress comes from a worry center about some expected outcome, right? Or some expected behavior or outcome. And so what part of that was stressing you? Was it was it an in-game stress because of the gameplay, or was it an out-of-game stress because of the work? Does that make sense?
An out-of-game stress. I think it was just to do with like some of these encounters that we've created now will feel trivial or won't have the same progression that we expected to provide the players with this new mechanic. And that's going to make these encounters not work as well. And it's going to, like, I didn't want the players to feel like, you know, the designers were not thinking about this. We're not considering this when they were designing, that they weren't really thinking about what the player would do.
It's kind of like, I'm just thinking about it this way of like, you're driving down the street and all the streets are designed a very specific way. But then, some company releases, actually, it's the same thing that's happening in real life with self-driving cars. Is basically the fact that like the power base of the cars has changed, and so people's expectations around what's possible, what's not possible, how streets have to be constructed, etc., has it's changed the dynamic. But what's interesting is you said it was an outside stress. I would still identify how you just talked about it as kind of an inside the game stress, because one of the things, and this is one of the things that impressed me most about your interview, is like, even though you felt like a personal attachment to the outside part of this, of the work bit, everything that you expressed was actually player based, right? And so like you're always player centric or player first. And so it wasn't, oh my God, think about how much more work we have to do, right? Because that was taking into the fact that like, well, now the experience has changed for players. It's not that I have to do that work, like it's an arduous task. It's that we have to do that work to make the players happy.
Yeah.
Right. And so to me, that like I wanted to call that out because a lot of game designers, when they're first starting out, their response would have been, oh, I put 60 hours into this specific dungeon. Now I have to put 20 more in. Right.
Yeah.
And so like there is a very real response there. But your response wasn't really about the outside tasking. It was more about stress around, now I have kind of an unsolvable problem. How do I solve it? And it's not unsolvable, but like, my toolbox doesn't necessarily have the right tools yet, right?
Yeah.
And it's really cool that you were able to go back and redo some of the dungeons. So like fun point 2 is you turned something that was potentially negatively viewed as more work into an opportunity, right? And so like you put the game and players ahead in the way you talked about it. And, if I were to give, earlier like young designers some advice anywhere in this podcast, it would be like, hey, go back and listen to the last like 5 to 10 minutes, because the way that your viewpoint on things was player centric, opportunity. Like, do you see what I'm kind of getting at? It was it was more about like, I want to be a great game designer, not this is my job.
Yeah.
And I think it's super important. And the reason I'm calling that out is because I think people will gloss over that and not actually hear that in what you're saying unless it's actually bookmarked. And it is an important lesson for early game designers to understand that adversity also brings opportunities. And so, being a little bit neuroplastic or the ability to think on your feet. So let me ask you a little bit about like, okay, so now we have a rule set change, right? Players can now encounter the dungeons totally differently. I want you to talk about the stuff that you probably take for granted and break down how you problem solved it, because I think there's something very important to call out psychologically in the designer brain as far as like how you're thinking about this new problem, because it's different when you start from scratch, right? You've got blue sky, you have control of all of the rules, you're the lead designer. Nothing gets presented to the player, that you don't want them to know. But in a live game situation, you basically got thrown a curveball. And so, your training basically took you to, all right, let's break this down. And so what I want you to do is go through the steps, just like give me the bullet point list of like, all right, let's talk about the dungeon. I'm sorry, it was a dungeon, wells.
Yeah, Portal Well.
And how, like, less about what the mechanical solves were, but more about your thought process through how you actually came to it. I'm assuming you came to a solution. Okay, all right.
Funnily enough, I was so worried about player response about it. But when it got down to it, even though I did read some responses like on Reddit and stuff that were less than positive about it, I was like way more okay with it than I thought, because there was plenty of positives. There was plenty of some were definitely fair criticisms. And honestly, it was just fun to see that people cared enough to discuss it, because I tried a few different things and they didn't all pay off. But it was just cool to see that it left an impression and that it stood out to people.
This episode is brought to you by Polestar. There's only one true way to experience the all-electric luxury SUV Polestar 3, and that's to take a test drive. It can go from 0 to 60 in as little as 4.8 seconds with the dynamic handling of a sports car. But to truly understand how it commands the road, you need to be behind the wheel. Up to 350 miles of range, the 3D surround sound system by Bowers & Wilkins. It's all something you have to experience to believe. So book your test drive for Polestar 3 today at polestar.com.
If you went on a road trip and you didn't stop for a Big Mac or drop a crispy fry between the car seats or use your McDonald's bag as a placemat, then that wasn't a road trip. It was just a really long drive. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
At participating McDonald's.
So the Portal Well, it was definitely, I think, my biggest challenge working in Nightingale, because a lot of our encounters were much smaller, like 8-meter radius, 30-meter radius, POIs, and a lot of the ones... Yeah.
Hold on. So POI equals...
Point of interest.
Point of interest. And then the radius is important because...
Oh, because that's the size that we are given to design. And the blocks that we have to work with are 4 meter by 4 meter typically. So that doesn't give us a lot of space sometimes to be able to create different things where players are not going to get stuck and still make them unique.
Got it. Yep. Sorry, that's just for the audience, just so they know that
for sure.
the radius is important because it determines the size of the play space, and then the POI is just point of interest. And the way that point of interest, I'm assuming that this has to do with how they're generated in the world. So point of interest.
Because the maps are procedurally generated to an extent, with some things being placed. So the one really good thing about the grappling hooks being added was now we can add more verticality to our POIs, which means that the really small POIs could now be taller. They could now have more floating buildings that are easier to get to. So that opened up the space for us a little bit. And some of those issues with the grappling hooks were resolved just because some of the POIs were left to like earlier realms or ones that were not the main realms. But for the portal well...
sorry. So back to our train of thought. Explain to me your step-by-step problem solving to get to the solution. We still haven't mentioned what your actual solution was. So you should describe that at some point, but I think I want to go on the full journey of like, I thought about this, then that gave me this, and I thought about this, and I got to here. So give me the step-by-step, and then like, so the solution is...
So the big part was talking to the narrative designers about what exactly was going on there before I even got anywhere. I know that there was portal well. I know there was a broken portal at the very bottom. It was supposed to be cinematic, huge. It was supposed to be one of the focal points of that realm. And you're supposed to know that there is a boss that is hidden somewhere at the bottom behind the dungeon that elves used to live. Sorry, not elves, fae. What am I talking about? Like they build structures around this well. So this well isn't naturally made. There's like pathways and columns, and it's very clearly been made by the fae. And the question was, okay, how do we then get to the boss that's been locked away by the fae? They put in a bunch of safeguards to make sure that it wasn't easy for anyone to just open up and let that boss out. So after I talked to narrative, and I kind of talked to them throughout, because I really wanted that to be, like, I really wanted whatever I designed to fit as best as it could with the narrative. And the realm, because the portal and other things in there were broken, there was a bunch of gravitational anomalies. So floating rocks were a big part of Welkin's Reach. They were massive ones with buildings, but in the portal, there was just a bunch of rocks that were kind of floating in the middle and coming out. And that's what I wanted to do as the focal point of, okay, these are very clearly meant as something that you can traverse on if you want to. And some of the options for traversal on there were simply for loot. So there's treasures and stuff that you can find if you have a fun time bouncing around. Okay. And the rocks were far enough apart because I didn't want to hide the portal at the bottom. So I couldn't make the area like too tightly enclosed. So I had jump pads that were elsewhere in the game as well, in certain parts of the rocks, so you could also get yourself higher up. So my biggest thing was, okay, now how do I actually create something that will encourage them, besides loot, to go around and try to explore as much of the area as possible? And so I came up with a 2-tiered puzzle solution, which I thought it actually ended up causing some problems because most of the puzzles in the game are like, you go to a place and there's one specific type of puzzle. And you're done that puzzle. Or in a dungeon, you have like maybe one followed by another. But in my case, I actually put together several puzzles in a way that you had to do them in order, and they depended on you finishing another puzzle. And one was agility and one was a memory puzzle. And what I didn't count on is that because this wasn't really something people have seen before, that they weren't going to see it as maybe oh, this is a more advanced puzzle, but they would see it as a frustration. So that's something that I wasn't quite expecting. I did see some people were really excited about that being a multi-step puzzle, but the basis of it was there is at the very bottom, you have to shoot like 3 beams in order. 2 of those beams are hidden behind like a grated door, and you can't shoot through that grated door. You have to open it. How do you open it? Well, higher up in the portal, there are 2 sections which are part of the agility puzzles where the player identifies, oh, I have to stand on this area. It opens up a door for you to get into where that memory puzzle piece is. You have to fight some enemies. You have to open up the door, and then you have to do it another way. And then finally, you get to finish the memory puzzle and carry on. So it's not a super complicated puzzle, but because the area to work with was something like 140 meters or something. There was so many challenges with how do I make sure the player can tell, first of all, where those memory puzzle pieces are when they're used to like 20, 30 meters. And then how do they figure out that they have to do it in pieces? Will they be able to, solve this? So yeah, it was a huge space. I thought it was unique, and there were some difficulties, but ultimately, I still liked the end result.
I know what you're saying. I need to go play it now. It sounds really fun. So I want to dig in a little bit on the puzzle construction and solution, because you've identified a challenge, which I essentially call it like informed buyer problem. Is like you need to have or for puzzles, it's basically informed puzzle solver, right? And so it sounds like there were some gaps in communication, or actually not necessarily communication, player comprehension, right? Because I think you can show things sometimes, but they don't always connect to the larger picture. So the 2 places where you stood to open the grates, was there like a cutaway video or something showing the grates opening, or how did you communicate success?
So at first, it wasn't the grate that was opening, but I had to open like the door to get to the grates. And it does make sound, but it, once again, large distance, it's hard to tell. And you're right, there were limits to what I can do. And the other thing is, because of the resources I had at my disposal, I couldn't really introduce a ton of new mechanics or anything like that, or visuals. So what I ended up doing is we had some examples of moving platforms. We hadn't used them very much, but what I had is when you got onto a platform that was opening the door, I also had some moving rocks come out from underneath you, and they would stagger themselves into the direction of the door. And they wouldn't be there for a long time, but they would be producing like the creaky rock noises, and they would be pretty close to you. So if you were looking at all, you would notice that they were like creating this path for you to get to the open door.
Got it. Okay. Maybe it was a little too subtle for some people, but I would have to see it. So like now I need to play it so that you and I can finish this conversation like at another time.
Yeah, for sure.
So basically, let me see if I can recap. Stand on basically a pressure plate, open the door that leads you to that opens up the area for you to shoot the thing. Right? And I'll just call it thing.
And you just fight things in between there, like fight some enemies, some spawn.
How far away were these door switches? Were they in totally different parts of the dungeon?
No, they were actually, if you're thinking about it like a cylinder, they were on opposite sides, and the doors that you had to open were almost identical. But they were different enough that you could identify that, like, okay, I already opened that one's not open. They were like shining gold and everything, but yeah, they were made similar enough that if you solved one of them, you'd be like, okay, now I have to do it again on the second. And then just the inside was a little bit different with like the combat that you have there.
So, sorry, not having seen it, you can
imagine your confusion. Yeah, it's a lot.
I've got a pretty good picture of it. Just sort of throwing out some for next time. So one of the things, what I mean about like informed puzzle solver is like, you don't have a lot of time to tutorialize, but you can show a less complex, or not complex. So distance creates a complexity in puzzle solving.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? And so also line of sight. So if you can't see directly what the result is, it can cause a cognitive block. One way to have gotten around this was to put a gate, and I'm using the word gate abstractly, like basically gate the player from something or like a reward by putting the puzzle pattern earlier in the dungeon, right? So it's like there's a plate right next to the door, which is right next to the thing you shoot, which then gives you a chest, right? And so like you foreshadow the later puzzle with something that seems trivial and like maybe easy or too easy, so that basically it's almost like putting the instructions in the world. Right? And so like that to me sounds like a reasonable fail-safe. By the way, you can only assume, like I've done this so many times, that like not everybody gets everything ever. It just doesn't, there's just not, sometimes it's circumstance, sometimes it's actually in-world forces are against you. Like I'm playing at the computer, and at the moment that you're showing them the clue, your friend shows up with a cucumber sandwich and gives it to you and distracts you from the information intake, right? There are things that are outside of your control. And so you can only really shotgun for like the best case scenario, right? You can't always assume that people are like, 100% focused on stuff. And so allowing the player a little grace later on, is definitely, if this were like the third dungeon with this type of puzzle in it, you could get much more, heavy in your requirements. But I think because this was a new mechanic, it definitely caused like specific issues for you. And I could see where some of your stress came from. But it was fun. Obviously I wish we had done this multi-tiered mechanic a bit more, but it is what it is. And if we had a few more effects and stuff, I think we could have told the story a bit better. But I think it was reasonable for the requirements given. And funnily enough, one of the tricky parts was actually playtesting that big boy, because there were so many floating rocks and they were a bit different, and you want to make sure that people aren't frustrated and falling off rocks where they shouldn't be. But when there's a lot of them, trying to test every single one is just, even for the QA team, I remember they just would spend hours trying to figure out what could break and what is wrong. And then you have the grapple hooks, the umbrellas, the different cards you can play, the jump pads. It's a lot to test. And at some point, I think you do have to stop at, this is good enough. The only place where that really caused an issue, like not being good enough, was at the very end of this level, there is a portal that teleports you to the boss. And what we've discovered is that players are really crafty, and you can glitch things by getting just close enough to this portal, building another portal like on top of it halfway through but a little bit over, and then you can portal to that portal and get through without hitting the colliders. Wow. And oh my goodness, just the things that QA brought back to me is like, oh yeah, they climbed on this, they grappled, and then they fell through this one tiny area. There were just so many ways of trying to break something that I couldn't even come up with. It was wild. In fact, having been one of those players myself, as far as like, that used to be like a pastime of mine, which was always like I said, I was an emergent gameplay person who was like, here, I'll give it to you as for instance, when I was working on Trespasser, it was one of the, like an early physics game. But the physics back then were pretty simple. And, we had big dinosaurs, and you were never intended to be able to shoot a T-Rex and kill it unless you had a lot of bullets, right? And so generally you just weren't equipped. However, physics impact can cause massive damage, but you had to have something something small moving very quickly, or something very, very big hit the T-Rex to be able to kill it. So here, I'll just put the puzzle solution together for you. Like a 1 meter box that was very light on the ground with a Calico 9mm, which has 99 rounds, right? So enough of a physics force push to rapid fire to get the box to move a certain way. And basically, if you shoot the box correctly, you could give it enough momentum and shoot it, like roll it end over end into a T-Rex and kill it.
Amazing.
And so, like, I don't think anybody's, you know what? I need to go back and catch some of this on video. Like, streaming, I missed, like, the streaming Twitch world by, like, too many years, but now I guess is my chance to go back. But what's interesting about that is, like, players will always they'll start to figure out the rules of the world. And because they're coming from a different POV than you are, they're looking to exploit, not create, right? They will always find solutions that are different. So, okay, we're almost out of time, but what I want to do is I want to recap a little bit because, like, this is what I heard your brain going through when solving this problem, right? Or at least your methodology. So you went and talked to the narrative designers, you re-examined the dungeon, you started looking at what the constraints were. So essentially what you were doing was you put a boundary on the problem and the constraints. So you gave yourself a rule set to design within, right? And, like, you know, it's really good that you went to the narrative designers because I think you found some ways to wrap in not just a functionally mechanical solution to the problem, but also one that fit the narrative, created like exciting moments for the player, and also fit within the believable world. And then what was also fun about the way you broke it down is, like, you really looked at the key differentiators for the space to inform the puzzles that you wanted to design and the solutions. And so I think that's really key. Is essentially you chefed it. You came in and you were like, okay, what do I got? I got this, I've got a protein, I've got this, I've got these ingredients. How do I put these ingredients together? You know, in whatever, I'm sure there was a time constraint as well, into a package that I think the audience will love. And so it sounds like the only real speed bump was introducing compound puzzles to an audience that weren't quite ready for it. But
and a couple of other small unrelated things, but ultimately it was fun. And honestly, I took screenshots of my process, and let's just say my first couple of attempts as I was figuring things out, just no relation to the end product. Like, I'm so, you know, that's why you can't stick to your original designs, and you can't get so hung up on them. You can create so much better if you're flexible.
Oh my God, I would love to see those. If you could you, and I'll circle back on this. Like, I was like, could you put that stuff on your website as part of your portfolio? Like, this
it is actually. It's on it's on the PDF, but I'll put it on my portfolio later on. The PDF is linked on my website, but I'll totally just highlight where that is.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting because then, like, you know, for anybody that comes in and looks at your stuff, you could be like, yeah, this is how I broke down this problem. And also, like, from a hiring manager standpoint, it's a great, like, window into how you think.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, but it's also, but from a younger designer or someone looking for inspiration, it's not only a window into how you think, but it's also, like, potentially a thought pattern that they can go through to imprint for themselves. Awesome. We're about out of time. Is there anything else that you want to talk about really quickly or mention before we sign off?
Nope. I think anything I say now is going to start another long conversation, and we'll have to save it for next time.
You and I could probably talk game design for, like, actually, there's no limit. We should just keep going. But you have to come back on. I want to sort of, I want to break down some of the other stuff that you worked on. Things that are maybe not game, where we encounter different player models or player types, because I think the ADHD project, I think the ADHD project is actually really interesting because though it's not pure game design, there is, like, reward loops and structures for people that have a very specific player model, right? And I think that's super interesting, and I would love to break that down from, like, how do we approach that as game designers. So you'll have to come back on in the next couple months or so we can talk about that.
Yeah, it was lovely. It was actually a lot of fun. My first time being on a podcast, and you know, not nearly as stressful as I thought it would be. So, hooray!
I told you it would be easy peasy. Awesome. Well, thanks for being on.
For sure.
Stay on for a few minutes, but that's the end of the podcast. Brain Arcade is a Princess Hermit production, produced by Kyrene Kim, music and mixing by Jonathan Ontiveros. The podcast is hosted by me, Chris Cross. You can find me and my other endeavors at coffeewithcross.com.
I'm Iris, host of Or Whatever Movies and the forthcoming Powers of Darkness podcast. For the better part of a decade, we've been unraveling a literary mystery that begins with a strange version of Dracula. Yes, that Dracula. It's a different story, imbued with a potentially insidious agenda. What we've already found so far reshapes what we thought we knew, but the investigation isn't over. Support our efforts to finish what we've started and bring the full story to light. Go now to Kickstarter.com and search up Powers of Darkness to learn more. Coming soon on Electricast, wherever you listen to podcasts. Electricast. Electricast.